They were only in their early 20s, but Heather Horst and her husband Brandon were desperate to start a family.
He loved kids. She very much wanted a baby.
However, a family would always elude them.
Every couple months, she'd miscarry.
It was just a sad time. He was devastated.
But then, after 3 years of trying, it was the rest of the family that would be devastated.
My husband's hurt.
I couldn't see him breathing with all the blood.
Was it a suicide?
He was unhappy with his life.
Was it payback?
Sometimes something's got to give.
Or did the desperate would-be mother have something to hide?
When they look at my phone, they're going to see. They're not going to find anything.
She's a manipulative little bitch.
She knew exactly what strings she could pull.
One of the scariest people I've dealt with.
August 5th, 2013, St. Paul, Minnesota. It was a little after 1 o'clock on Monday morning when Ramsey County 911 received a panicked phone call from 24-year-old Heather Horst.
I need you guys to send somebody right now.
Heather told the 911 operator that she and her friend Angela had just come home and found her husband, 25-year-old Brandon Horst, sprawled on the couple's bed, covered in blood.
He's not moving.
The operator routed police to the scene and then transferred Heather to the EMS dispatcher.
We're sending you some help. Any idea what happened? How did your husband get bloody?
I don't know. I just got home.
Where's the blood coming from?
I think his head.
But when the dispatcher asked her to check whether her husband was alive or dead, Heather refused.
Can you touch him?
The dispatcher was taken aback.
I'm sorry?
I can't.
Okay, here's what I need you to do. You need to go touch him and figure out if we can give him some help.
She definitely was crying, and she does sound upset.
It was understandable considering the circumstances.
He has a lot of blood.
So with Heather apparently too distraught to act, the responsibility fell to Heather's friend, Angela.
Is your friend checking him out?
And when Angela did check on Brandon, she made an awful discovery.
He's not warm.
Like he's cold?
Yep.
And when the police and paramedics arrived, they confirmed it. Brandon was dead.
He had an injury to his head, which appeared to be a gunshot wound.
They were thinking that this could be a potential suicide.
But at the same time, they also had questions for Heather, largely due to something she said to Angela moments earlier, shortly before they supposedly discovered that her husband was dead.
They want you to touch the bodies.
Born in 1989, Heather Leanne Schwartz spent much of her life in St. Paul.
It's a close-knit community. People from St. Paul have a tendency to stay in St. Paul. It's like a giant family.
Growing up, Heather was a quiet child who loved to sing.
She didn't seem to have too many friends.
Although by high school, she had found her niche.
Heather was in choir. She was popular with the choir kids.
And she was starting to be noticed elsewhere, too, thanks to a new hobby.
She did a lot of like belly dancing and stuff, so she was physically fit. And that was, one thing that, attracted a lot of guys to her.
Including a fellow student named Brandon Horst. A year ahead of Heather in school, Brandon wasn't technically from St. Paul.
Brandon was born on an army base. And when he was 5 years old, we moved to South St. Paul.
And by the time he and Heather were in high school, Brandon wasn't exactly one of the popular kids in his class.
He wasn't in any sports. He was a band geek.
He played the clarinet. He was very academic. He was very smart, very intelligent. He had some math awards. He was good with numbers and computers.
When Brandon met Heather, something clicked.
They met through Heather's best friend, and they just started dating.
The scrawny computer nerd was a strange match for Heather, who was popular with the boys. But against all the odds, Heather picked Brandon.
Brandon thought, hey, I'm, with one of the hot girls in high school.
They seemed to really care for each other.
They were, kind of a cute couple together.
However, their relationship didn't appear destined to last beyond high school. From an early age, Brandon dreamed of following his mother's example.
He wanted to do something for his country.
He wanted to be in the military.
And once he graduated, Brandon left Heather behind.
He immediately went into the military and joined the Air National Guard.
In 2006, during training in Texas, Brandon's superiors noticed his talent with computers.
They had him doing computer work with the Air National Guard. He picked it up very, very quickly.
He just naturally had this gift, and they really thought that that was something that the military could utilize.
His training finished, the Air Guard put his skills to work overseas.
He got deployed to Saudi Arabia.
He was really being groomed by the National Guard for his technical gifts and talents.
And by the time Brandon returned from his deployment in Saudi Arabia, nearly 4 years had gone by. And it looked as if he and Heather would be nothing more than former high school sweethearts.
Heather Horst had been engaged with someone.
But that didn't mean Brandon had forgotten Heather.
She was pretty much his first girlfriend. That's one thing that you'll never forget.
Back in St. Paul in 2010 and assigned to the Air Guard base at the Minneapolis airport, it was almost unavoidable that Brandon and Heather would get back in touch.
These communities are pretty tight-knit and pretty small, and people sort of continue to grow up in their social circles.
And when they did reconnect, it was soon clear that Heather hadn't forgotten Brandon either, despite the fact that she was engaged to someone else.
She broke off that engagement.
Happily reunited, the couple picked up right where they left off years earlier.
Brandon and Heather's relationship was very serious.
And within weeks, it produced some exciting news.
She said she was pregnant.
Brandon was thrilled.
Being a father was something Brandon looked forward to.
He wanted kids. He loved kids.
So soon after Heather announced that she was pregnant, Brandon asked her to make their little family official.
He proposed.
He wanted to make sure the baby and her were taken care of.
In December 2010, Brandon and Heather married in an intimate family ceremony.
Brandon was in his military uniform. She had a nice dress on.
She was 7 months pregnant at that point.
And as they prepared for the birth of their child, 22-year-old Brandon hoped it would be the first of many.
His hopes and dreams were that he was going to have a big family.
But just a few weeks after their wedding, shortly after the Christmas holiday, Heather and Brandon's dreams would be crushed.
We were told that she had lost the baby.
For newlyweds who had been so excited to start a family, the news was overwhelming.
He was devastated.
We had a memorial service for the baby. It was just a sad time.
Brandon and Heather didn't give up, though.
Heather Horst desperately wanted to be pregnant.
But apparently, wanting something desperately was no guarantee of success.
Every couple months, she'd be pregnant, and then, a month later, she'd miscarry.
However, the couple appeared confident that a child would eventually come. To prepare, Brandon and Heather even bought a home in St. Paul.
They found this small, nice house in St. Paul on Bellows Avenue that they're very excited to purchase.
Soon after, Heather enrolled in a nursing program.
One of her dreams was to be a nurse. She ended up at Inver Hills Community College for her nurse's training.
Meanwhile, Brandon continued to flourish in his career. In 2011, after 5 years in the service, he was promoted to sergeant.
They saw him absolutely as an up-and-coming leader.
One with demanding responsibilities.
He was actually in charge of physical security for the base. The alarm systems, the monitoring systems, the closed camera, TV systems. He was in charge of all of that.
His life was coming together quite nicely for him.
He had a very bright future before him.
And since the new job and new promotion also came with a raise, Heather dropped out of nursing school to look after the couple's new home at Brandon's urging.
He wanted the old classic American dream. Husband goes out and works, wife stays at home, tends to the kids in the house.
Even if, for the moment, they had no kids of their own.
She had created a nursery in their home, and she posted herself on care.com to take care of other people's children.
And despite the multiple miscarriages, Heather held on to hope that a child would eventually come.
She very much wanted a baby.
But as it turned out, Heather had another devastating loss in her future. Only this time it wouldn't be a baby. It would be her husband. At a little after 1 a.m. on August 5th, 2013, police and paramedics in St. Paul, Minnesota, raced to the home of 24-year-old Heather Horst.
Heather Horst places a 911 phone call at 1:11 a.m.
In the call, Heather said that she and a friend had just found her husband, 25-year-old Brandon.
911 operator was that the body was cold.
When the police and paramedics arrived at the scene a few minutes later, they confirmed that Brandon was dead.
There was blood pooled around his head. It was evident he had been shot.
But by whom?
It didn't look like the door had been kicked in or anything of that nature.
IDs, wallets, an iPad, things that would sometimes be stolen in a home invasion robbery or a burglary, those things were all present.
With no sign of a robbery, the police at the scene began to suspect another possibility.
The initial reaction from the first responders was that this was possibly a suicide.
However, while a quick search around the bed did turn up a single spent shell casing, there was one small problem with the suicide scenario.
They could not find a weapon.
Not that the police believe that necessarily ruled out a suicide.
Because of the positioning of the body, they believed that the gun was underneath the body.
Police are thinking that he rolled on top of it after he shot himself.
However, the investigators weren't willing to disturb the body just yet, not until it had been properly documented and photographed. So while the CSI techs went to work, the detectives turned to Heather and her friend.
We needed to bring them down to our headquarters to get a better statement where there'd be no distractions.
Heather seemed strangely subdued during the drive.
She just rode very stoically down to police headquarters. It was very odd.
Or was it simply shock? After all, she had just lost her husband on top of a series of devastating miscarriages. Once at headquarters, the investigators questioned Heather and her friend in separate interrogation rooms.
Those were the only two witnesses that we had to go on.
And they made it clear to Heather from the start that a witness was all they considered her to be at that time.
She was treated as a grieving family member, and we were trying to just gather information from her.
In the interview, Heather said Brandon had given no indication that he might have been contemplating suicide that night.
How was his mood when he got home?
Good. I mean, we smoked a cigarette and talked. He was talking about his eyes because he did LASIK a couple of days ago.
Then, after hanging out on the couch and watching TV for a while, Heather said Brandon had gone to bed, but she had discovered that she was out of the over-the-counter sleep aid she took.
You needed to get some melatonin?
Yeah.
You have trouble sleeping?
Yeah.
She calls Angela and said, "Hey, do you want to make a run to Walgreens with me?"
And when they came back an hour later, Brandon was dead.
I turned on the light and I couldn't see him breathing. I saw his skin color and all the blood.
Across the hall, Heather's friend Angela told the investigators a similar story.
They had plans that the two of them would get together later in the evening.
Although contrary to what Heather told the police, Angela said she was the one who called Heather, not the other way around.
I called her at like 11 something or another.
Okay. So you called her at about 11 something?
Yeah.
They weren't consistent, and it was at that point and in the interview that I began to think that there was more to the story.
Whoever made the call The two friends were out a little after midnight.
They drive to a Walgreens that is not too far away.
And when the pair returned to Heather's, the plan was to stay up and watch a movie, according to Angela.
She's like, hey, Angie, I'm gonna go upstairs, wake up Brandon.
But Angela said that she'd barely sat down on the sofa.
I started hearing her freak out.
And when Angela dashed upstairs, she realized why her friend was freaking out.
I saw blood on his lips.
Okay.
Like, trying to clean down.
However, what happened next, once Heather dialed 911, puzzled the investigators.
She does not want to perform CPR. She didn't want to touch him.
Typically, when a loved one is hurt, the person who finds them tries to render some form of aid or see if they're breathing or try to talk to them or try to shake them. And Heather did none of that.
Which was doubly odd in Heather's case, since she had studied to be a nurse.
She had a significant amount of medical training.
And that wasn't all that surprised the investigators about the 911 call either.
They want you to touch the bodies.
Rather than calling her husband Brandon, she referred to him as the body, which we found very strange.
Was it simply an honest assessment, one based on her medical training? Or was there more to it? Because while Heather and Angela were being questioned, the crime scene investigators back at the house were wrapping up their preliminary sweep of the couple's bedroom.
They'd found an entrance and an exit wound, and then they found the casing.
They absolutely thought potential suicide.
All they needed to confirm it was the gun, which they believed was under Brandon's body.
They had to wait until the medical examiner arrived on scene and could help them roll the body to determine whether or not a gun was in fact there.
But when the medical examiner and the crime scene investigators rolled Brandon's body aside,
They did not locate a gun.
And that could only mean one thing.
This is not a suicide. There's foul play.
Brandon Horst had been murdered. And when the crime scene investigators contacted headquarters to share their findings, with the detectives questioning Heather and her friend Angela, the entire tenor of the investigation changed.
It turned from this is a grieving widow to this is a suspect.
What happened in the bedroom?
Nice try. I told you what happened.
Did you kill your husband?
No.
She started to get more and more defensive at that point.
I'm feeling like I need a lawyer.
The investigators immediately stopped both interviews.
They were never really in custody. They were just being questioned. They were free to leave at any point.
However, not before the investigators confiscated one last piece of evidence.
Do you have your cell phone?
Yeah.
You pull it out for me.
Are you guys taking it?
Yeah, we'll probably have to collect that as evidence.
Right now?
Right now.
And then, once they had collected Heather's cell phone, the investigators had an officer drive Heather and her friend home.
The two of them were riding together in the same squad car, and there is automatic video that occurs when someone is being transported in a squad car.
And once again, the investigators couldn't help notice Heather's demeanor as she talked to her friend.
Have you ever been in the backseat of one of these? How does that make you feel?
Trapped.
She is very defensive.
I am not going to get accused of this again.
She was more concerned about that than she was about the loss of her husband.
Although at the same time, she seemed strangely unconcerned that the investigators had confiscated her cell phone.
And they're not going to find anything? I just can't wait till those tests get back.
And the reason she was so unconcerned, more than anything, raised the investigators' suspicions about Heather.
She had taken her SIM card out.
By the morning of August 6, 2013, it had been 24 hours since 24-year-old Heather Horst had called 911 and reported finding her husband Brandon dead in their St. Paul, Minnesota home. The 25-year-old staff sergeant in the Air National Guard had been shot once in the head.
Police ruled Brandon Horst's death a homicide.
The young man's friends and family were stunned by the news.
I really did not want to believe it. We knew no one would harm Brandon.
The authorities, on the other hand, had already begun to suspect Heather knew more about her husband's death than she was letting on. For starters, Heather and the female friend who'd been with her when she found Brandon's body had given slightly different accounts of the evening.
Their statements were not lining up.
The detectives might have written off those differences to the stress of the situation if it weren't for one thing. When they confiscated Heather's cell phone on the night of the murder, they made a surprising discovery.
When the police collected her cell phone later on in the early morning hours, there was no SIM card in the phone.
And why would she have done that? As far as the investigators were concerned, there was only one explanation for the missing SIM card.
She took out her SIM card from her cell phone to cover her tracks.
However, if that was Heather's plan, it backfired.
The homicide detectives just knew there was more to the story.
So that morning, their first priority was looking into Heather's alibi.
Heather made a big deal about how she had to go to Walgreens.
And when police went to Walgreens and pulled the store's security footage, Heather's story appeared to check out.
She's seen on videotape at Walgreens coming in at approximately 18 minutes past midnight.
However, the investigators couldn't help but notice that while the two women were in the store, Heather apparently received a text.
At 12:35, Heather Horst looks at her phone.
And whatever was in the text produced an immediate reaction from Heather and her friend.
They're beelining it out of the store.
They're seen quickly getting into the vehicle, and they, quote unquote, discover the body, according to the initial timeline that Heather had provided police.
What was in the text that Heather received? And if it was connected to Brandon's murder, what motive did she have to kill her husband? Hoping for some answers, the investigators turned to Brandon's family. And when they did, the investigators made yet another suspicious discovery about the supposedly grieving widow.
She would not respond to any phone calls.
Despite the fact that in the 24 hours since Brandon had been shot, his parents had been frantically trying to reach her.
She had clearly cut herself off from the family.
That wasn't all Brandon's family and friends told the investigators either. They also said that his marriage to Heather had been in trouble.
Brandon and Heather were constantly arguing about everything.
And according to friends and family, Heather was the one who started most of the fights.
She was addicted to drama. Everything was made into a bigger deal than it really needed to be.
Several friends said they had urged Brandon to end his marriage.
There were several of us that spoke with him and said, hey, you need to get out of this. This is a toxic relationship.
He was unhappy with his life.
But despite his unhappiness, friends and family said he had been determined to stand by Heather.
He didn't want to get a divorce.
And besides, how could he walk out on Heather after barely 2 years and a string of devastating miscarriages?
Brandon was in it for real, and he wanted to make it work.
But even Brandon had his limit, one he'd apparently reached by the summer of 2013.
He had his suspicions that she was cheating on him.
And by the end of July, he told family and friends that he'd confirmed it.
Heather was having an affair.
According to the family, the discovery was a turning point for Brandon.
He was done with the marriage.
And his coworker, Cameron Church, claims he said as much during a smoke break at Fort Snelling.
I'll never forget. We lit up our cigarettes, and during the course of the conversation, he told me that he was going to go home after work and tell Heather that he wanted a divorce.
Was that why Brandon Horst had been murdered in his bed less than a week later?
She said that to several people, that she wouldn't know what to do if Brandon divorced her.
He was her only support. He paid all the bills. He paid the mortgage.
However, there was a way her husband could continue paying those bills, even if he wasn't in Heather's life. Thanks to his National Guard experience, Brandon was well insured.
Brandon had approximately $480,000 in life insurance.
But was that almost $500,000 payoff enough to convince the 24-year-old to commit murder? Brandon's friends certainly thought so.
She would have been set.
But a jury would require a little more convincing. So the investigators decided to lean on what they hoped was the weak link in the plot. Heather's friend Angela, who'd accompanied her on the trip to Walgreens on the night of Brandon's murder.
They were creating an alibi at Walgreens on the security cameras.
At least that's what the investigators had come to believe. And on August 9th, they brought Angela in for another round of questioning.
She broke and gave up what happened to the extent that she knew.
And Heather's friend said she knew a lot. Not only the name of Brandon's killer, but why he'd done it. And according to her, it didn't have anything to do with divorce or insurance. Heather's friend told the investigators it had all started on the morning of August 4th, when she was hanging out at her apartment with 25-year-old Aaron Allen.
They were boyfriend and girlfriend. Heather was an acquaintance of theirs.
And according to her friend, Heather had come by at around 10 that morning.
She was extremely upset, very emotional.
Comes in the door enraged, and she goes into this story about how Brandon attacked her.
Heather told you that Brandon had assaulted her.
Yeah.
And according to Angela, that wasn't all Heather claimed either.
She said he killed the baby.
Claimed she had just come from the hospital and had a miscarriage.
In fact, Angela claimed that Brandon's abuse had secretly been the cause of all Heather's miscarriages.
She claimed he pushed her down the stairs and caused a miscarriage, and that he had punched her stomach when she found out she was pregnant and caused a miscarriage that way.
How many times did she show up with bruises?
Too many to count.
However, Angela also claimed that she'd had nothing to do with Brandon's murder. Instead, Angela said she'd told Heather to get away from Brandon.
How many times did you tell her to leave him?
At least 100 or more.
According to Angela, the first hint she'd had about the murder plot was on the way home from Walgreens on the morning of August 5th, when they'd met Aaron walking down the street a block from Heather's house and given him a ride home.
Wasn't it bizarre that you picked up Erin a block away from her house?
Yeah. But to be quite honest, I didn't think to question it.
At least not until later, when they finally got back to Heather's and found Brandon dead.
Why did he do this?
To protect her.
Aaron Allen was a person who was abused physically.
Aaron Allen felt very deeply about protecting other people from what he had experienced himself.
And the investigators had evidence that suggested Angela was telling the truth. Because when they pulled Heather's cell phone records, guess who she'd been trading texts with on the night of Brandon's murder?
Aaron Allen was, in fact, the person that she had been corresponding with.
Questioned that same night, Aaron admitted he'd heard Heather's claims about Brandon.
I've heard that Brandon was abusive. I've heard that he's taken her phone from her, that he disabled the truck a couple of times so she couldn't leave, took keys from her.
But Aaron also said those claims had surprised him.
I met the kid twice, and he didn't seem abusive.
Sure.
He didn't seem like he would do things like that.
Sure.
So it's like, you know, I mean, I know you can't always judge a book by its cover, but at the same point, sometimes something's got to give.
Sure.
And just what did he mean by that? The investigators wanted to know.
Do you read maps very well?
No. I'm not a map person.
Okay. This is a map of the west side. These little red points all over, those are cell phone towers.
The police are able to determine where a particular person is located based on what tower their cell phone is using,
putting him at the time and place of the murder.
Why would your phone be up there on Sunday night, Monday morning?
The question had an immediate effect on Aaron.
Is this an accusation? Because if it is, I want an attorney.
Aaron may have been through talking, but as the investigators quickly made clear, he wasn't free to go.
Going to be under arrest for the murder of Brandon Horst.
And within hours, the St. Paul police had taken Heather into custody as well and charged her with Brandon's murder too. May 15th, 2014, St. Paul, Minnesota. Heather Horst was on trial at the Ramsey County Courthouse, charged with masterminding the August 2013 murder of her husband, Brandon. The 25-year-old had been free on bond ever since her arrest.
She was able to post bond through the help of, as we understand it, family members. And so she was out walking on the street again.
Although in its opening statement, the prosecution argued that Heather had orchestrated Brandon's murder in order to stay off the streets.
Brandon Horst had apparently told Heather Horst that he was done with their marriage.
And the divorce would likely cost Heather her home and her primary means of support.
She would have nothing if Brandon left. She wouldn't have a place to live. She wouldn't have any money.
So according to the prosecutors, Heather had set her sights on her husband's $500,000 in life insurance.
She wanted the insurance money. She wanted to be set. She wanted to be taken care of.
Even if Brandon had to die.
She was selfish and cowardly. Brandon was killed while he slept in his home.
Heather didn't kill him, though. According to the prosecutors, she'd convinced Aaron Allen to shoot Brandon.
He was a puppet on a string for her, and she knew exactly what strings she could pull.
She was able to discover that Aaron had been abused as a child and began to manipulate that and use that to her advantage.
And according to the prosecutors, she had used it to turn Aaron into a willing assassin.
Heather Horst told Aaron Allen that Brandon Horst was abusing her and that he had punched her in her abdomen to cause miscarriages. He had thrown her downstairs.
And that just infuriated him, made him enraged.
However, according to the prosecutors, Heather's medical records revealed a significant flaw in Heather's story.
She had never been pregnant.
We could never confirm a pregnancy at any time.
Which meant that everything she'd told Aaron and Brandon was a lie.
She never miscarried.
And when the authorities had passed that information along to Aaron,
he realized that he'd been lied to.
To learn that Brandon was a good guy, and that what she was saying to him wasn't true, I think was a real eye-opener for him.
So much of an eye-opener that the 26-year-old had agreed to cooperate with the authorities.
He didn't want to be the only one going down for this.
In March of 2014, with Heather's trial approaching, Aaron had pled guilty to second-degree murder.
He was given a sentence of 40 years in prison.
And in exchange for that deal, he took the stand 2 months later on May 16th as the state's star witness against Heather.
We asked him, why are you coming forward? Why are you testifying? And he said, it's the right thing to do, and I want justice for Brandon and his family.
On the stand, Aaron told the jury how he'd fallen for Heather's claims of abuse.
He believed her and didn't check to see if she was telling the truth.
He wanted to stop the abuse at any cost.
And according to Aaron, that was exactly what Heather wanted.
She said, enough is enough. I can't take it anymore. I want him dead.
According to Aaron's testimony, once he'd agreed to kill Brandon, Heather had quickly come up with a plan.
She's going to put Aaron Allen in the basement to lie in wait for her husband.
On the stand, Aaron explained how, while Brandon had been at work on the evening of August 4th, 2013, Heather had driven him to the couple's home.
On the way there, Aaron Allen is having second thoughts. She starts chiming in with this manipulation.
Remember what he did to the babies.
Aaron said that once Heather had persuaded him to go through with the plan, she'd hidden him in the basement and given him a gun.
She's the transportation. She provides the firearm.
According to Aaron, he'd waited for hours until Brandon came home from work. And then, once her husband had gone upstairs to bed, he said that Heather had left the house and picked up Aaron's fiance prior to their trip to Walgreens to establish an alibi.
Made sure she was seen on camera. Made sure to pay for her purchase using a debit card.
Aaron testified that once Heather had left the house, he had come out of his hiding place at around 12:30 and silently crept up the stairs to where Brandon slept.
Aaron Allen says he just stood halfway in the doorway and fired one shot.
I don't understand how someone could stand over Brandon's sleeping body and do that.
To do it while he is sleeping and unable to protect himself, it's an act of a coward.
On the stand, it appeared that Aaron agreed.
When he was going through the details, he was almost physically shaking.
He really realized what he did was wrong, and he was remorseful for it.
But would the jury believe the story of a confessed murderer, especially one who cut a plea deal?
He's protecting himself from the possibility of first-degree murder charges.
And Brandon's murder wasn't his first brush with the law either.
He's got prior felonies.
He has a long history of convictions. He was kind of a questionable character.
It was something the defense was determined to use to their advantage.
The defense approach in this case was that this was a fantasy killing and that Aaron Allen did it all on his own.
Lucky for the prosecution, they had some evidence to back up Aaron's claims. The text messages that Heather thought she had permanently deleted.
Through a forensic analysis, text messages were found in the deleted space of Heather Horst's phone in that hard drive area of her phone.
The text messages were, I think he's up, he's not sleeping, what should I do, things of that nature.
And then at 12:35 came one last message, the one she could be seen reading in the Walgreens security video, the one that sent Heather and her friend scurrying home.
The jury saw the footage of Heather Horst in a hurried manner, getting into her truck and taking off.
And what was the message Aaron had sent to Heather? The one that sent her rushing home to find her husband's body. As it turned out, the message consisted of a single word: done. On May 27, 2014, the jury announced that it had just reached a verdict in the trial of Heather Horst. The 25-year-old was charged with masterminding the 2013 murder of her husband Brandon in the couple's St. Paul, Minnesota home.
She was sort of a puppet master. It was all because of her that Brandon Horst was dead.
At trial, the prosecution had some powerful evidence to support their case. First, they had the testimony of the confessed triggerman, 26-year-old Aaron Allen.
Aaron Allen went into extreme detail from start to finish, from the planning of Brandon's death, how Heather manipulated him.
Heather convinced Aaron to murder Brandon because of the alleged abuse Brandon was doing to Heather.
And in addition to Aaron's testimony, the prosecutors had recovered the text messages he'd exchanged with Heather on the night of the murder, including the final one-word text.
The word done to indicate that he has executed Brandon, that he is dead.
I think that was probably the most damning piece of evidence against her.
Would the jury agree? It had taken only 2 hours to reach a verdict.
It was pretty much shocking that it had taken such a short amount of time.
The tensions were probably as high as I've ever seen them in any trial, if not more.
And when the verdict was read, Heather was indeed done.
She was convicted on all counts.
I just started crying.
It all flowed out. It was just tears of relief.
It felt like a huge weight was lifted off me.
At the defense table, it was tough to gauge Heather's reaction.
Just straight face, stone face. There was nothing.
And when the judge offered her a chance to speak before passing sentence,
she just stood there and stared at him, so he waited a few moments, then he sentenced her to life in prison.
Without the possibility of parole. And as far as Brandon's family and the prosecutors are concerned, that's exactly what Heather deserved.
She's a controlling, manipulative little bitch.
She truly, for someone so young, was one of the scariest people I've dealt with.
Rome, Italy, July 26, 1992. Behind the locked door of a safe apartment, the silence felt almost unnatural. Outside, the city carried on with the rhythm of an ordinary summer morning. Traffic flowed through crowded streets. Church bells marked another day. People hurried to work, unaware that several floors above them, a 17-year-old girl was confronting a loneliness that few adults could ever imagine. Her name was Rita Atria. She had once believed that telling the truth would save lives. Now she was no longer certain that it could even save her own. A week earlier, everything that had given her the strength to endure had been ripped away in an instant. The man she trusted more than anyone else, the man she affectionately called Uncle Paolo, had been murdered in one of the most devastating mafia attacks in modern Italian history. Anti-mafia prosecutor Paolo Borsellino, together with the police officers assigned to protect him, had been killed in a massive car bombing on Via d'Amelio in Palermo. The explosion echoed far beyond Sicily. It shook the entire nation. It also shattered the fragile emotional foundation that had kept one frightened teenage witness. Moving forward, when investigators later examined the circumstances surrounding Rita's death, they reached a clear official conclusion. She had not been murdered. There was no evidence that someone had entered the apartment or physically forced her to end her life. The official finding was suicide. Yet reducing her story to that single word would leave out everything that truly mattered. It would ignore the years of fear that came before that morning. It would overlook the impossible choices forced upon a child who had grown up in the shadow of organized crime. Most importantly, it would fail to explain how a 17-year-old girl came to believe that she had no future left to live. This is not a mystery about identifying an unknown killer. It is not a story built around hidden forensic evidence or an unexpected courtroom confession. Instead, it is the story of a young witness whose greatest act of courage also became the source of her deepest isolation. It is about the enormous personal cost of breaking one of the oldest and most powerful unwritten rules of the Sicilian mafia, omerta, the law of silence. For generations, omerta had governed countless lives across parts of Sicily. It demanded absolute loyalty, not simply to family, but to an entire system built upon fear. Speaking to the authorities was considered the ultimate betrayal. Silence was rewarded. Truth was punished. Many accepted this reality because they believed they had no alternative. Others obeyed because they feared the consequences of resistance. Entire communities learned to survive by pretending not to see what happened around them. Rita Atria was born into that world. Unlike investigators who spent years trying to penetrate mafia networks from the outside, Rita grew up inside a family connected to Cosa Nostra. Violence was not an abstract concept discussed on television or reported in newspapers. It was something that entered her home and permanently altered her childhood. Before reaching adulthood, she would lose both her father and her older brother to mafia violence. Those deaths alone would have been enough to define a lifetime of grief. Instead, they became only the beginning of a far more difficult journey. As she grew older, Rita found herself carrying dangerous knowledge that no teenager should ever possess. Through conversations with her older brother, she became aware of the identities of local mafia figures, unresolved killings, criminal alliances, drug trafficking activities, and hidden relationships that linked organized crime with local political structures. She was never a member of the mafia herself. She did not participate in criminal activity. Yet knowledge has its own weight, and sometimes merely knowing the truth can place a person in extraordinary danger. After her brother was murdered, Rita faced a decision that would determine the rest of her short life. She could remain silent, preserving the traditions that had governed her family for generations. Or she could cooperate with the Italian justice system. It was not merely a legal decision. It was an emotional, cultural, and deeply personal rupture. Choosing justice meant abandoning the code under which she had been raised. It also meant accepting that she might never again have a normal life. When she finally agreed to testify, the person who listened most carefully was Paolo Borsellino, one of Italy's most respected anti-mafia prosecutors. By then, Borsellino already understood better than most people how dangerous such cooperation could be. Every witness who chose to speak represented not only an opportunity to dismantle criminal organizations, but also a human being whose life would be forever changed. Rita was only 17. Behind the official witness statements and investigative files was a frightened young woman who had already buried much of her family and now faced the possibility of losing everyone else she loved. The information she provided became valuable to investigators. Together with testimony from her sister-in-law, Pira Aiello, it contributed to the arrest of multiple mafia members and supported investigations into influential figures connected to organized crime in her hometown. Those legal achievements mattered. They demonstrated that the wall of silence surrounding Cosa Nostra could, in fact, be broken. But victories inside a courtroom did not erase the emotional consequences waiting outside. Because she had chosen to cooperate with the authorities, Rita could no longer remain in her hometown. She entered the Witness Protection Program and was relocated to Rome. Her life became one of constant movement, protected residences, changing routines, and permanent police security. The familiar streets of Sicily disappeared behind her. Friends vanished from her daily life. Even the ordinary experiences that define adolescence became impossible. Every new address was temporary. Every unfamiliar apartment served as another reminder that the price of telling the truth was exile. Perhaps the deepest wound came not from the mafia itself, but from within her own family. According to the values enforced by Omerta, speaking to investigators was unforgivable. Rita's mother viewed her daughter's cooperation not as an act of courage, but as an act of disgrace. She rejected her completely, severing their relationship. For a teenager who had already lost her father and brother, that rejection created another form of bereavement. She was still alive, yet she had effectively become an orphan in every emotional sense. During those difficult months, Paolo Borsellino became more than the prosecutor responsible for taking her testimony. He became a source of reassurance in a life that had been stripped of certainty. Rita affectionately referred to him as Uncle Paolo, a simple expression that revealed the trust she had placed in him. In a world where betrayal seemed inevitable and familiar faces kept disappearing, his presence represented stability. He embodied the belief that justice could still prevail, even against an organization as deeply rooted and feared as Cosa Nostra. Then came July 19th, 1992. The bombing on Via D'Amelio lasted only a moment. but its consequences extended far beyond the destruction left on the street in Palermo. Paolo Borsellino and the 5 police officers protecting him were killed instantly. The assassination occurred less than 2 months after another devastating mafia attack had claimed the life of prosecutor Giovanni Falcone. Italy watched in horror as 2 of the country's most determined anti-mafia magistrates were eliminated within weeks of each other. For the nation, it was a profound crisis. For Rita, it was intensely personal. She later expressed, through her writings, the depth of that loss. She believed Borsellino had died for the principles he defended. Without him, she felt that part of herself had also died. The person who had given her confidence that her sacrifices had meaning was suddenly gone. The Witness Protection Program could provide physical security, but it could not replace the emotional support she had lost. Fear returned with renewed force. She worried that no one could protect her anymore. She feared that the mafia would eventually find her. Even more devastating was the belief that everything she had sacrificed, her family, her home, her identity, might ultimately have been in vain. Only 7 days separated the explosion on Via D'Amelio from the morning inside that apartment in Rome. 7 days during which grief, fear, exhaustion, and isolation converged into a despair that proved impossible for her to overcome. Today, Rita Atria is remembered not because she solved every crime or defeated the mafia by herself. She is remembered because, despite being raised inside a family connected to organized crime, she chose a different path. She chose to speak when silence was expected. She chose justice when loyalty demanded otherwise. She was never a mafia member seeking forgiveness. She was something perhaps even rarer, a young civilian witness who refused to accept that violence. And secrecy should determine the course of her life. Her story is therefore not only about death. It is about courage tested beyond ordinary limits. It is about the invisible burden carried by those who become witnesses against powerful criminal organizations. It is about the emotional consequences that remain long after court documents have been filed and arrests have been made. And above all, it is about a 17-year-old girl whose decision to tell the truth continues to resonate decades later, reminding us that the greatest acts of bravery are often performed not by those who possess extraordinary strength, but by ordinary people who decide that fear will no longer dictate what they know to be right. Long before Rita Atria's name became associated with courage, justice, and resistance against organized crime, she was simply a child growing up in a small Sicilian town where certain realities were accepted without question. She did not choose the circumstances of her birth, nor did she understand, as a young girl, how profoundly those circumstances would shape the course of her life. By the time she reached adolescence, violence, grief, and impossible moral choices would become inseparable from her everyday existence. Yet to understand why her later decisions carried such extraordinary significance, it is first necessary to understand the world into which she was born, a world where silence was often considered more valuable than truth. Rita Atria was born on September 4th, 1974, in Partana, a town in the province of Trapani on the island of Sicily, Italy. Like many Sicilian communities during that era, Partana possessed a rich cultural identity rooted in generations of family traditions, close-knit neighborhoods, and strong social bonds. Families often knew one another for decades. Personal reputations carried tremendous weight, and loyalty to relatives was regarded as one of the highest virtues. Yet beneath that familiar sense of community existed another system of authority, one that operated largely outside the official institutions of government. In many places across Sicily, the influence of Cosa Nostra extended far beyond criminal enterprises. It shaped relationships, inspired fear, and imposed rules that many people followed not because they believed in them, but because disobedience could carry devastating consequences. Rita entered this environment without understanding its complexities. Like every child, her earliest experiences were centered on family. Home was the place where she learned whom to trust, whom to admire, and what values appeared to govern the adult world around her. Unlike children raised far from organized crime, however, Rita's family was directly connected to that hidden system. Her father, Vito Atria, was a local member of the Sicilian Mafia. That fact would later become central to understanding both the dangers Rita faced and the extraordinary nature of the decisions she would eventually make. For a young child, the concept of organized crime is almost impossible to comprehend. A father is simply a father. A family is simply a family. Children rarely possess the knowledge necessary to distinguish between ordinary social life and the invisible structures surrounding it. Rita's earliest years therefore unfolded within an environment that, to her, probably seemed entirely normal. She could not yet recognize the significance of the alliances, rivalries, and unspoken rules that govern the lives of many adults around her. Those realities would reveal themselves only through tragedy. The first devastating turning point arrived in 1985. Rita was only 11 years old when her father was murdered. His death was not the result of an accident, nor was it an isolated act of violence. According to the known facts of the case, Vito Atria was killed during an internal mafia conflict, becoming another victim of the brutal power struggles that periodically erupted within Cosa Nostra. Such conflicts were driven by rivalries, shifting loyalties, and struggles for influence. While the organizations often projected an image of discipline and order, internal violence remained an ever-present reality. Membership did not guarantee protection. Even those inside the organization could quickly become targets. For Rita, however, the political or criminal motives behind her father's murder mattered far less than the emotional reality of losing him. At 11 years old, she experienced the sudden absence of a parent whose place within the family could never be replaced. Childhood is often measured through milestones, school years, birthdays, holidays, friendships, but traumatic loss interrupts that natural rhythm. Before adolescence had truly begun, Rita was forced to confront death in a deeply personal way. The impact of such an experience cannot be measured only by the event itself. A violent death reshapes the emotional landscape of an entire family. Every conversation afterward carries the weight of what has been lost. Every future celebration is marked by an empty place. Even ordinary routines become reminders of absence. Rita's family entered a period of grief, but within the cultural environment shaped by mafia traditions, grief was also intertwined with expectations surrounding loyalty, honor, and revenge. Among those most deeply affected by Vito Atria's death was Rita's older brother, Nicola Atria. Unlike Rita, Nicola was himself involved with the mafia. Following their father's murder, he embraced an obligation deeply embedded within that world. He vowed to avenge his father's death. Such promises reflected the cycle of retaliation that had characterized mafia conflicts for generations. Violence often produced more violence, with each killing becoming justification for another. Justice, as understood through the legal system, frequently gave way to personal vengeance enforced through criminal networks. For Rita, Nicola became an increasingly important figure after their father's death. Their relationship grew closer during these years of shared grief. As siblings navigating profound loss, they spent more time together. And through those interactions, Rita gradually became exposed to information that few outsiders ever heard. Nicola spoke openly with her about the realities surrounding him. He discussed local mafia leaders, unresolved killings, criminal rivalries, drug trafficking activities, and the connections between organized crime and influential figures within local political structures. These conversations were not lessons intended to recruit Rita into criminal life. The available historical information makes clear that she herself never became a mafia member. Rather, through proximity to her brother and family circumstances, she accumulated knowledge that would later become extraordinarily significant. Knowledge, however, carries its own burden. Unlike physical evidence that can be hidden or destroyed, memories cannot simply be erased. Every name remembered, every conversation overheard, every explanation given by Nicola remained with Rita. As she matured into adolescence, she unknowingly became someone who possessed valuable information about criminal activities operating within her community. She had not sought this responsibility. It had been placed upon her by circumstance. The contrast between Rita's position and that of her brother is important. Nicola remained committed to the mafia world into which he had been born. Rita, by contrast, occupied a different place entirely. She observed rather than participated. She listened rather than acted. This distinction would later define the legal and moral understanding of her role. She was not someone seeking forgiveness for crimes she had committed. She was a young woman who happened to know the truth because of the family into which she had been born. As the months passed following their father's death, the atmosphere surrounding the family remained overshadowed by instability. The internal conflicts affecting mafia organizations rarely ended with a single killing. Violence often unfolded as a prolonged sequence of retaliatory attacks, each generating new grievances and new targets. Individuals who believed they had settled old scores frequently discovered that they had only created fresh enemies. This environment left little room for lasting security. Then, in June 1991, tragedy struck the Atria family once again. Nicola Atria was murdered by the mafia. The exact circumstances of his killing lie beyond the information available here. But the consequences for Rita are unmistakable. She had now lost both her father and her brother to the same criminal system that had shaped her childhood. Within just a few years, the two most important male figures in her immediate family had been taken from her through mafia violence. The emotional impact of Nicola's death differed from the loss of her father in one crucial respect. In 1991, Rita was no longer an 11-year-old child struggling to understand events beyond her control. She was 17 years old enough to recognize patterns, question inherited beliefs, and evaluate the consequences of the world surrounding her. The deaths of both her father and brother forced an unavoidable question upon those left behind. Would the cycle continue indefinitely, or was another path possible? That question confronted Nicola's widow, Pira Aiello, with particular urgency. Rather than embracing further retaliation, Pira chose an entirely different response. She decided to cooperate with the Italian authorities in pursuit of justice. In doing so, she rejected the expectation that loyalty to mafia traditions required silence. Her decision represented a profound break with the values imposed by organized crime. For Rita, watching her sister-in-law make that choice proved deeply significant. She had spent years absorbing the belief that speaking to law enforcement constituted the ultimate betrayal. Yet she had also witnessed firsthand where unquestioning loyalty had led her own family. Her father was dead. Her brother was dead. The promise of revenge had not restored what had been lost. Instead, it had extended the suffering. During this period, Rita found herself standing between two opposing visions of the future. One path demanded continued obedience to omerta, preserving silence regardless of the personal cost. The other required trusting institutions that generations within her own community had often viewed with suspicion. Neither option offered safety. Remaining silent would not bring back her loved ones. Speaking out could make her the target of those determined to protect the mafia's secrets. It is difficult to appreciate the magnitude of that dilemma without remembering Rita's age. 17-year-olds are typically occupied with education, friendships, ambitions, and a gradual transition into adulthood. Rita instead faced questions involving organized crime, witness cooperation, and personal survival. Every decision carried consequences extending far beyond herself. She knew names. She knew stories. She knew details that investigators had long sought to uncover. Yet she also understood the unwritten rule that governed the world she had always known. Those who spoke risked losing everything. The world surrounding Rita had taught her that silence guaranteed belonging. Family loyalty was measured not merely through affection, but through unquestioning obedience. To reject Omerta was to challenge an entire cultural system reinforced through fear, expectation, and generations of precedent. The emotional cost of such a decision would prove almost as painful as the physical dangers that accompanied it. By the middle of 1991, the foundations of Rita's life had already been transformed beyond recognition. She was no longer simply the daughter of Vito Atria or the younger sister of Nicola Atria. She had become the keeper of dangerous knowledge, a grieving teenager searching for meaning after unimaginable loss, and a young woman approaching the most consequential decision of her life. What happened next would not only redefine her own future, but would also establish her place in Italy's long and difficult struggle against the silence imposed by organized crime. The murder of Nicola Atria in June 1991 marked the moment when Rita Atria's life divided into two distinct chapters. Everything that had come before had been shaped by the world into which she had been born. A world where violence seemed inevitable and silence was treated as a sacred obligation. Everything that followed would be defined by a choice that almost no one expected a 17-year-old girl from a mafia family to make. Rita could continue living according to the unwritten code that had governed generations before her, or she could reject it completely. Neither path promised safety. One demanded silence in the face of murder. The other required extraordinary courage while offering no guarantee that justice would ultimately prevail. In the days and weeks after Nicola's death, grief settled over those closest to him. Losing a husband, a brother, or a son is never a simple event from which people quickly recover. Every memory suddenly becomes connected to absence. Every familiar place recalls someone who will never return. Yet within families connected to Cosa Nostra, mourning was often accompanied by another expectation: loyalty to Omerta. Publicly speaking about mafia crimes, identifying those responsible, or cooperating with investigators violated one of the organization's most deeply rooted principles. Silence was not merely encouraged, it was demanded. For many people raised within that culture, Omerta represented far more than refusing to answer police questions. It became a way of understanding the relationship between family, honor, and survival. Problems were expected to remain inside the community. Justice sought through official institutions was viewed as betrayal. Fear reinforced these beliefs because those who broke the code often faced severe consequences. Generations had learned that speaking openly about mafia activity could endanger not only the witness, but also relatives and friends. As a result, countless crimes remained hidden behind walls of silence that investigators struggled to penetrate. It was within this environment that Nicola's widow, Pira Aiello, reached a decision that would alter the course of several lives. Instead of accepting the traditional expectation of silence or pursuing another cycle of revenge, she chose to cooperate with the Italian authorities. Her objective was not retaliation through further violence, but justice through the legal system. That decision represented a profound rejection of the values imposed by organized crime. It also required immense personal courage. By agreeing to speak with investigators, She knowingly placed herself in danger while challenging the authority of Cosa Nostra. For Rita, Pira's decision became impossible to ignore. She had spent years listening to conversations that revealed the hidden workings of mafia life. Through her brother, she had learned the identities of local mafia leaders, details concerning unresolved killings, information about drug trafficking, and the relationships linking criminal organizations with local political figures. She had never participated in those activities herself, but she possessed knowledge that could prove invaluable to investigators. Until then, that knowledge had remained trapped within the boundaries imposed by Omerta. The question confronting Rita was therefore deeply personal. She was not deciding whether to reveal information discovered through independent investigation. She was deciding what to do with memories connected to her own family. Every name she remembered belonged to a world that had shaped her childhood. Every fact she possessed had reached her because she was the daughter of Vito Atria and the sister of Nicola Atria. Speaking meant crossing a line that many believed should never be crossed. The weight of that decision cannot be measured solely through legal consequences. For Rita, it meant reevaluating everything she had been taught about loyalty. She had already witnessed where unquestioning allegiance to mafia traditions had led. Her father had been murdered. Her brother had followed the same path and suffered the same fate. The promise that loyalty would protect the family had proven tragically false. Instead of preserving those she loved, the criminal world had taken them away one after another. The system that demanded silence had offered no protection from violence. Gradually, Rita reached a conclusion that distinguished her from many others born into similar circumstances. She chose not to preserve the silence that had surrounded so many crimes. Instead, she decided to cooperate with the justice system. This was not a spontaneous act driven by anger alone. It represented a deliberate rejection of the belief that violence should remain hidden simply because powerful people demanded secrecy. At only 17 years old, Rita accepted responsibilities that most adults would find overwhelming. In November 1991, she formally began providing testimony to the Italian judicial authorities. The prosecutor who personally received her statements was Paolo Borsellino, one of the country's leading anti-mafia magistrates. By that time, Borsellino had devoted years of his professional life to confronting organized crime in Sicily. He understood that every new witness represented more than another source of information. Each witness was also a human being whose life would be transformed by the decision to cooperate. When Rita first began speaking with Borsellino, she was still a teenager, carrying the emotional scars of losing both her father and her brother. She did not arrive as a hardened criminal attempting to negotiate a reduced sentence. She did not seek personal advantage through cooperation. Her position was fundamentally different. She had never been a participant in mafia operations. Instead, she became what Italian authorities recognized as a witness for justice. Someone willing to reveal the truth despite extraordinary personal risk. During her testimony, Rita shared everything she knew within the limits of her knowledge. She identified numerous local mafia figures whose names had long circulated within criminal circles. She described information relating to the murders of both her father and her brother, helping investigators better understand the violence that had devastated her family. She provided details concerning the connections between mafia organizations and local political structures, an area of particular importance because organized crime often depended upon corrupt relationships extending beyond purely criminal networks. She also discussed numerous violent incidents that had occurred around Partana and explained aspects of how the local mafia families operated. Piece by piece, investigators assembled a broader understanding of criminal activities that had remained concealed behind years of fear and silence. Each statement Rita gave represented more than evidence collected for official files. Every interview required her to revisit painful memories. Describing the people responsible for violence also meant remembering the violence itself. The process of cooperating with investigators often demands repeated recollection of traumatic events, requiring witnesses to relive experiences they might otherwise wish desperately to forget. Rita nevertheless continued, believing that the truth deserved to be recorded despite the emotional burden involved. Her testimony did not exist in isolation. Together with the cooperation provided by Pira Aiello, Rita's information contributed to significant progress in ongoing investigations. Authorities were able to arrest multiple mafia members, while inquiries expanded to include influential individuals connected with local government. The importance of these developments extended beyond individual prosecutions. They demonstrated that even deeply entrenched criminal organizations could be challenged when witnesses found the courage to speak openly. Yet legal progress carried a heavy personal price. From the moment Rita agreed to cooperate, her former life effectively ended. Remaining in Partana was no longer possible. The risks associated with her testimony required immediate protective measures. Italian authorities placed Rita under the Witness Protection Program and relocated her to Rome, far from the community where she had spent her entire childhood. Life under witness protection bears little resemblance to ordinary existence. Familiar streets disappear overnight. The routines that once provided comfort are replaced by constant uncertainty. Protected residences become temporary homes. Daily movements are carefully managed. Security considerations influence nearly every aspect of ordinary life. For adults, adapting to such conditions is already extraordinarily difficult. For a 17-year-old who had recently lost much of her family, the emotional challenge became even greater. Rome offered physical distance from Sicily, but distance alone could not erase fear. Rita understood why she required protection. The information she had shared threatened powerful individuals with strong incentives to preserve their secrecy. Witness protection, therefore, represented both security and isolation. Every safeguard served as a reminder that her life had fundamentally changed. Perhaps even more painful than leaving Partana was losing the possibility of reconciliation with her own family. According to the mafia's interpretation of loyalty, Rita's cooperation with authorities constituted an unforgivable betrayal. The reaction from her mother reflected that harsh reality. Rather than supporting her daughter's decision, she viewed it as a source of shame. She rejected Rita and severed their relationship completely. For many young people, parents remain the final source of comfort during moments of crisis. Rita no longer possessed that refuge. She had already lost her father through murder. Her brother was gone. Now her mother had chosen to cut ties because Rita refused to obey Omerta. The result was an almost unimaginable emotional isolation. She was alive, yet separated from nearly every relationship that had once defined her identity. Within that isolation, one figure emerged as a crucial source of emotional stability: Paolo Borsellino. Although his official role centered on investigating organized crime, his relationship with Rita extended beyond formal legal procedures. She came to trust him deeply, referring to him affectionately as Uncle Paolo. The nickname reflected the reassurance he provided during one of the darkest periods of her young life. Having lost so many family members, Rita found in Borsellino someone who listened carefully, treated her with dignity, and understood the immense sacrifice she had made. That trust became one of the most important emotional foundations supporting Rita during her months in witness protection. Surrounded by unfamiliar places, protected by police officers, and separated from nearly everyone she had once known, she needed someone who could remind her that her decision still mattered. Borsellino represented more than the authority of the Italian justice system. He embodied the belief that truth could overcome fear and that breaking omerta was not an act of betrayal, but an act of moral courage. By late 1991 and the first half of 1992, Rita had already sacrificed almost everything that had once made her life familiar. She had abandoned her hometown, accepted permanent protection, lost the support of her mother, and committed herself to assisting investigations into one of the world's most powerful criminal organizations. The journey had demanded extraordinary resilience from someone who had not yet reached adulthood. Yet even after everything she had endured, the greatest test still lay ahead. The person who had become her strongest source of hope, the man she called Uncle Paolo, was himself living under constant threat. His determination to confront Cosa Nostra had made him one of the mafia's principal targets. Rita could not know that within months, another devastating act of violence would once again transform her life, leaving her to confront a level of despair from which she would never fully recover. By the summer of 1992, Rita Atria had already endured more loss than many people experience in an entire lifetime. She had buried her father after an internal mafia conflict claimed his life. She had mourned her older brother, Nicola, whose own involvement with Cosa Nostra had ended in another violent death. She had abandoned her hometown, accepted the restrictions of witness protection, and sacrificed her relationship with her mother after choosing to cooperate with the Italian justice system. Through every painful transition, one constant remained. Paolo Borsellino represented stability in a life that had become increasingly defined by uncertainty. As the prosecutor responsible for receiving her testimony, he had also become the person Rita trusted more than anyone else. She affectionately called him Uncle Paolo, a simple expression that reflected the confidence she placed in him. For Rita, he symbolized more than justice. He represented the belief that her sacrifices had meaning and that speaking the truth had not been in vain. That fragile hope would be shattered on July 19, 1992. On that day, the Sicilian Mafia carried out one of the most devastating attacks in modern Italian history. A car bomb exploded on Via D'Amelio in Palermo, killing anti-mafia prosecutor Paolo Borsellino and the 5 police officers assigned to protect him. The assassination sent shockwaves throughout Italy. It occurred less than 2 months after another monumental tragedy, the murder of anti-mafia prosecutor Giovanni Falcone. Within a remarkably short period, the country had lost 2 of its most determined and respected figures in the fight against organized crime. For the Italian public, the bombing represented a direct assault on the rule of law. For investigators, it underscored the enormous power and brutality that Cosa Nostra was willing to employ against those who challenged it. For Rita Atria, however, the explosion carried an even more intimate meaning. It destroyed the person she believed had stood beside her through the darkest chapter of her young life. The significance of Paolo Borsellino's death cannot be understood solely by considering his public role. To Italy, he was an anti-mafia magistrate who had dedicated his career to dismantling organized crime. To Rita, he had become the one adult she believed truly understood both the dangers she faced and the emotional burden she carried. After losing her father, her brother, and eventually the support of her own mother, Rita found in Borsellino someone who treated her with compassion while recognizing the courage required to testify against the mafia. Their relationship never erased the risks surrounding her, but it provided reassurance that she was not facing those dangers alone. The bombing on Via D'Amelio destroyed that reassurance instantly. For someone already living under witness protection, surrounded by uncertainty and separated from nearly everyone she had once known, the murder of Borsellino represented far more than the death of a respected public official. It removed the emotional foundation that had allowed her to endure isolation. Rita had accepted extraordinary sacrifices because she believed they served a greater purpose. Borsellino embodied that purpose. When he was killed, she struggled to imagine how the future she had envisioned could still exist. During the days following the bombing, Rita's emotional condition deteriorated rapidly. The information preserved from her personal writings reveals the depth of her despair. Reflecting upon Borsellino's death, she expressed the belief that he had died for the ideals he defended. Without him, she felt that she too was already dead. Those words reveal not only grief, but also the collapse of hope. They illustrate how profoundly she associated her own future with the man who had encouraged her. Decision to cooperate with justice. The emotional crisis that followed was shaped by several overlapping fears, each reinforcing the others. First came overwhelming grief. Rita had already experienced devastating personal losses, and Borsellino's assassination reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Instead of gradually recovering from earlier tragedies, she found herself confronting yet another irreversible absence. Alongside grief came fear. Witness protection had always provided physical security, but Rita increasingly questioned whether that protection could truly guarantee her safety. If one of Italy's most heavily protected anti-mafia prosecutors could be assassinated through such a devastating attack, she began to wonder who could possibly protect a 17-year-old witness. The bombing fundamentally altered her perception of security. It became difficult for her to believe that any protective measures could withstand the determination of an organization capable of carrying out such a highly destructive act. A third burden was isolation. Witness protection, while essential for safeguarding her life, inevitably separated Rita from the ordinary support networks available to most teenagers. She lived far from Partana in protected accommodation, constantly aware that her movements required caution. Her relationship with her mother had been severed because she chose to testify. Her father and brother were gone. Borsellino's death therefore left her with an overwhelming sense of emotional solitude. Physical security could not compensate for the absence of meaningful human connections. Finally came doubt. Rita began questioning whether everything she had sacrificed had accomplished anything lasting. She had given investigators information concerning mafia leaders, violent crimes, political connections, and criminal operations in her hometown, together with the testimony provided by Pira Aiello. Her cooperation had helped authorities arrest multiple mafia members and expand investigations into influential local figures. Those were genuine achievements. Yet in the emotional aftermath of Via D'Amelio, they no longer seemed sufficient to overcome the despair consuming her. The assassination of Borsellino made it appear as though organized crime remained overwhelmingly powerful despite the courage shown by those willing to resist it. The final week of Rita's life unfolded under the weight of these interconnected emotions. Every day brought renewed awareness that the person she depended upon was gone forever. Fear increasingly replaced confidence. Hope gradually gave way to hopelessness. The belief that justice would ultimately prevail became more difficult to sustain as she contemplated the deaths of the people who had inspired her to speak. According to the available historical record, Rita also became convinced that she no longer had anyone capable of protecting her. She feared that the mafia would eventually find her despite the witness protection program. Whether those fears reflected an immediate operational threat or the psychological consequences of losing Borsellino, they became very real to her. The distinction is important. Human behavior is often shaped not only by objective danger, but also by a person's perception of danger. Rita's writings indicate that she believed the future held little more than continued fear and isolation. As the days passed, her emotional state continued to worsen. The cumulative impact of years spent living with violence, bereavement, exile, and rejection had finally reached a breaking point. She was only 17 years old, yet she had already experienced circumstances capable of overwhelming people decades older. The burden she carried was not the result of a single traumatic event, but the accumulation of many. The murder of her father, the murder of her brother, separation from her family, life under constant protection, and finally the assassination of the one person she trusted most. On July 26, 1992, exactly 1 week after the bombing on Via D'Amelio, those emotional struggles reached their tragic conclusion. Rita was inside the protected apartment where she had been living in Rome. Before her death, she locked the apartment door. She also left a message expressing the despair that had overtaken her following Borsellino's assassination. According to the information preserved about her final note, she explained that she felt completely devastated after his death, believed there was no longer anyone able to protect her, and no longer found the strength to continue living under the constant weight of fear. After leaving that message, Rita jumped from the 7th-floor window of the building. She died at the age of just 17. The death of such an important witness naturally required official examination. Investigators were tasked with determining whether the circumstances pointed toward homicide or suicide. Given Rita's cooperation against the mafia and the enormous risks associated with her testimony, careful scrutiny of the available evidence was essential. Authorities examined the circumstances surrounding her death, including the conditions inside the apartment and the information she had left behind. The official investigation ultimately reached a clear conclusion. Rita Atria had died by suicide. The available evidence did not support a finding that she had been murdered. Her death was therefore officially classified as a suicide rather than a homicide. This conclusion remains the formal judicial determination regarding the circumstances of her death. Even so, Rita's story did not disappear from public discussion after the investigation concluded. Over the years that followed, some anti-mafia organizations argued that aspects surrounding her death deserved renewed examination, maintaining that certain questions had never been fully clarified. Their requests reflected continuing concern about the extraordinary pressures faced by witnesses, confronting organized crime and the broader historical context in which Rita's death occurred. However, those calls for further consideration did not alter the official conclusion reached by investigators. The established finding remained that Rita had taken her own life. Understanding that distinction is essential. Rita Atria was not the victim of a confirmed homicide. Her story is not one of an unidentified assassin escaping justice. Instead, it is the story of a young witness whose psychological suffering unfolded against the backdrop of relentless violence, family loss, social isolation, and the assassination of the prosecutor who had become her greatest source of support. The investigation into her death identified the immediate cause, but the broader tragedy extended far beyond legal classifications. Her final days demonstrated that organized crime can inflict profound harm not only through direct acts of violence, but also through the fear, grief, and isolation left in their wake. By the end of July 1992, Italy had lost not only one of its most courageous anti-mafia prosecutors, but also one of its youngest and most courageous witnesses. Paolo Borsellino had devoted his life to exposing the truth. Rita Atria had risked everything to help him do so. Although the official investigation determined that no one physically killed Rita, the events leading to her death became inseparable from the wider history of Cosa Nostra's campaign of violence and intimidation. Her life ended inside a quiet apartment in Rome, far from the streets of Partana where her story had begun. But the choices she made during those final months would continue to resonate long after the investigation into her death had reached its conclusion. when discussing the legal consequences connected to Rita Atria's story. It is important to recognize that there are actually two separate but closely related dimensions. The first concerns the impact of her cooperation with the Italian justice system and the role her testimony played in anti-mafia investigations. The second concerns the official investigation into her own death following the events of July 1992. Together, these two dimensions form the judicial conclusion of a story that began inside a mafia-connected family and ended with the loss of a 17-year-old witness whose courage challenged one of the most deeply entrenched criminal cultures in Italy. By the time of her death, Rita had already become an important witness for investigators attempting to understand the activities of Cosa Nostra in and around her hometown of Partana. Although she had never been a mafia member herself, her unique position within a family connected to organized crime provided her with knowledge that few outsiders possessed. The information she shared was not the result of undercover work, surveillance operations, or years of investigative research. It came from her lived experience and from conversations she had heard within her own family circle. What made her testimony particularly valuable was not merely the quantity of information she possessed, but the fact that she was willing to speak openly about matters that many people feared, discussing even in private. After beginning her cooperation with authorities in November 1991, Rita provided investigators with information concerning several key areas of interest. She identified local mafia figures, discussed matters connected to the murders of her father and brother, described relationships between organized crime and local political structures, and shared knowledge regarding violent incidents and criminal operations linked to mafia families in her community. Each statement contributed to a broader investigative effort aimed at exposing networks that had long benefited from secrecy and intimidation. Her testimony did not stand alone. Equally significant was the cooperation of her sister-in-law, Pira Aiello. Together, the information provided by the two women helped authorities build a clearer understanding of criminal activities operating within their area of Sicily. Investigators were able to pursue leads that might otherwise have remained hidden. Their cooperation contributed to the arrest of multiple mafia members and supported the expansion of investigations involving individuals who held influence within local government structures. These developments represented tangible legal consequences flowing directly from the decision of two women to reject omerta. The significance of those results extended beyond individual arrests. Organized crime organizations depend heavily upon secrecy. Witnesses who choose to cooperate often provide investigators with information that cannot easily be obtained through other methods. Financial records, surveillance, and physical evidence are important tools. But first-hand testimony frequently helps investigators connect separate pieces of information into a coherent picture. Rita's knowledge therefore became part of a larger effort to challenge the culture of silence that had protected mafia activities for generations. At the same time, her cooperation illustrated the immense personal costs associated with becoming a witness against organized crime. Every legal success carried consequences for Rita's private life. She could no longer live openly in Partana. She entered witness protection and relocated to Rome. She lost contact with many elements of her former life. Most painfully, she became estranged from her mother, who viewed her decision to cooperate as an unforgivable violation of the Mafia Code of Silence. Thus, while investigators benefited from the information she provided, Rita herself paid a heavy emotional price for helping the justice system. These realities became even more tragic after the assassination of Paolo Borsellino on July 19, 1992. As discussed previously, Borsellino had become one of the most important sources of support in Rita's life. His death profoundly affected her emotional state. Only 1 week later, on July 26th, Rita died in Rome after leaving a message expressing despair over Borsellino's assassination and her belief that she could no longer continue living under the burden of fear and isolation. Because of Rita's role as an anti-mafia witness, her death inevitably attracted significant attention. Authorities could not simply assume what had happened. Any death involving an individual who had cooperated against organized crime required careful examination. Investigators therefore reviewed the available evidence to determine whether Rita had died as a result of homicide or suicide. The official investigation focused on the circumstances surrounding her final hours. Investigators examined the scene, considered the contents of the message she left behind, and evaluated the available evidence concerning her state of mind. Their task was to determine whether another individual had played a direct role in causing her death, or whether the available facts pointed toward a self-inflicted act. Following that examination, authorities reached a definitive conclusion. Rita Atria's death was officially ruled a suicide. The investigation did not establish that she had been murdered. No criminal homicide charges emerged from the inquiry because the evidence did not support a finding that another person had physically caused her death. Legally speaking, the case was therefore resolved with the conclusion that Rita had taken her own life. This official determination remains one of the most important facts in understanding her story. Over time, public discussions sometimes blurred the distinction between Rita's death and the numerous mafia murders surrounding her life. Because her father, brother, and mentor Paolo Borsellino had all died as a result of mafia violence, some observers naturally viewed her death through the same lens. Yet the official findings remained clear. Rita was not legally recognized as a murder victim. The investigation concluded that she died by suicide. Nevertheless, the end of the legal investigation did not end public reflection. In subsequent years, certain anti-mafia organizations called for aspects of the case to be revisited, arguing that some questions remained insufficiently clarified. These appeals reflected ongoing concern about the pressures Rita faced as a young witness living under extraordinary circumstances. However, it is essential to distinguish between requests for further examination and the actual findings of the investigation. Calls for renewed attention did not overturn the official conclusion. The established judicial determination continued to identify suicide as the cause of death. The legal outcome of Rita's own case, therefore, differed fundamentally from the outcomes associated with many traditional true crime narratives. There was no murder trial concerning her death. There was no prosecution of an alleged killer. There was no courtroom battle over competing homicide theories. Instead, the legal process focused on establishing the facts surrounding her final actions, ultimately concluding that she had ended her own life after a period of profound emotional distress. Yet to stop the analysis, there would overlook a deeper dimension of the story. While the investigation determined that no individual physically murdered Rita, her life remained inseparable from the violence that surrounded it. Every major turning point in her journey was connected to organized crime. Her father's murder introduced her to the devastating consequences of mafia conflict. Her brother's murder forced her to confront the failures of the culture that had shaped her family. Her decision to cooperate with authorities placed her under protection and isolated her from much of her former life. Finally, the assassination of Paolo Borsellino removed the person she trusted most, triggering the despair expressed in her final writings. This broader context explains why Rita occupies such a unique place within Italy's anti-mafia history. Legally, she was not classified as a mafia member who later became a state witness in exchange for reduced punishment. In Italy, individuals who once participated in criminal organizations and later cooperate with authorities are often described as pentiti, meaning repentant former members. Rita did not fit that category. She had never taken part in mafia crimes. She had never needed to confess criminal involvement because she had committed none. Instead, Rita came to be recognized as a collaboratrice de giustizia, a collaborator with justice, or witness for justice. This distinction carries enormous significance. It acknowledges that her contribution stemmed not from personal guilt, but from moral choice. She spoke because she believed the truth mattered. She cooperated because she refused to allow violence and secrecy to remain unquestioned. Her testimony represented an act of civic courage rather than an attempt to escape responsibility for criminal conduct. From a judicial perspective, this distinction helps explain why her legacy continues to resonate. Rita demonstrated that resistance to organized crime did not require prior involvement in criminal activity. Ordinary citizens, even those born into mafia families, could choose a different path. They could reject omerta and support the rule of law despite the risks involved. Ultimately, the legal consequences of Rita Atria's story extend far beyond the official documents produced by investigators and courts. Her testimony contributed to arrests and investigations. Her cooperation helped challenge networks of secrecy that had protected criminal activity. The inquiry into her death reached a formal conclusion, identifying suicide rather than homicide. Yet perhaps the most enduring legal consequence lies in the example she provided. Through her actions, she demonstrated that justice often depends upon individuals willing to speak despite fear. The legal system can investigate crimes, prosecute offenders, and issue judgments, but it frequently relies upon witnesses brave enough to tell the truth. Rita Atria paid an extraordinary price for making that choice. By the time the legal processes connected to her story had reached their conclusion, she was no longer alive to witness the full impact of her courage. Nevertheless, the information she provided remained part of Italy's continuing struggle against organized crime. Her testimony survived. The investigations she helped support continued. And although her own life ended tragically at 17, the legal and moral significance of her decision to break omerta endured long after the official case files were closed. On paper, Rita Atria's story appears to end on July 26, 1992. The official investigation concluded that she died by suicide at the age of 17. The legal process surrounding her death reached its conclusion, and the historical record clearly distinguishes her case for homicide. Yet some lives cannot be measured solely by the date on a death certificate. Rita's influence did not disappear with her final day in a protected apartment in Rome. Instead, the years that followed gradually transformed her from a frightened teenage witness into one of Italy's most enduring symbols of moral courage in the struggle against organized crime. Her legacy rests not on the length of her life, but on the extraordinary choice she made while she was alive. When people remember Rita Atria today, they are not remembering someone who defeated the mafia alone. They are not remembering a police officer, a judge, or a politician. Nor are they remembering a former criminal seeking redemption. They remember a young woman who had every reason to remain silent, yet consciously chose another path. Born into a family connected to Cosa Nostra, she inherited neither freedom nor safety. She inherited a world governed by fear, loyalty, and the expectation that family secrets should remain hidden regardless of the consequences. Against all those expectations, she decided that the truth deserved to be heard. That decision remains remarkable precisely because of who Rita was. She did not possess political influence. She held no public office. She commanded no institution capable of protecting her from retaliation. She was simply a 17-year-old girl carrying knowledge that had entered her life through circumstances she never chose. Every major turning point in her story came from forces beyond her control. She did not choose to be born into a mafia family. She did not choose for her father to become the victim of an internal mafia conflict. She did not choose for her brother to follow the same world that had already destroyed one generation of her family. She did not choose to lose him as well. Those tragedies were imposed upon her. What she did choose was how to respond after they occurred. That distinction is central to understanding her legacy. Courage is often imagined as something dramatic or fearless. Yet Rita's story suggests something different. Nothing in the historical record indicates that she stopped being afraid. On the contrary, fear accompanied nearly every stage of her journey. She understood the danger surrounding those who cooperated with investigators. She knew the consequences of violating omerta. She experienced the painful rejection of her own mother after choosing to testify. She lived under witness protection because the risks against her were considered real enough to require constant security measures. Her courage, therefore, did not consist in the absence of fear. It consisted in acting despite it. The months she spent cooperating with the Italian justice system also challenged long-standing assumptions surrounding the mafia's code of silence. Omerta had survived for generations because countless people believed breaking it was impossible. Fear discouraged witnesses from speaking. Family loyalty reinforced that silence. Communities learned to avoid discussing crimes that everyone knew had occurred. Rita's testimony demonstrated that this culture of silence was not invincible. Together with the cooperation of Pira Aiello, her decision contributed to arrests and expanded investigations into mafia activities and influential local figures. Those legal achievements mattered not simply because they affected individual criminal cases, but because they proved that truth could emerge even from within families closely connected to organized crime. Another important aspect of Rita's legacy lies in the way she has been remembered by Italian society. Rather than fading into obscurity, her name gradually became associated with education, civic responsibility, and opposition to organized crime. Schools, anti-mafia associations, books, and films have been named after or inspired by her life. These forms of remembrance serve purposes beyond honoring a single individual. They preserve the memory of someone whose experience illustrates the human cost of confronting criminal power. For students learning about the history of organized crime in Italy, Rita's story offers a perspective different from that of prosecutors, police officers, or judges. It reveals how deeply the mafia could affect the lives of ordinary young people who happen to be born into the wrong circumstances. Her example is especially significant because of her legal status. Rita is remembered not as a pentito, a former mafia participant seeking forgiveness through cooperation, but as a collaboratrice di giustizia, a witness for justice. That distinction remains essential. She had never participated in mafia crimes herself. She was not attempting to reduce a sentence or negotiate legal advantages. Instead, she chose to tell investigators what she knew because she believed the truth mattered. In doing so, she represented a different kind of resistance, one rooted not in personal redemption after criminal involvement, but in moral responsibility despite overwhelming pressure to remain silent. The story also forces difficult questions about the emotional burden carried by witnesses. Courts often evaluate testimony according to facts, evidence, and legal standards. Those elements are indispensable for justice. Yet they cannot fully measure the psychological cost of becoming a witness against organized crime. Rita's experience reminds us that entering witness protection means far more than changing addresses or receiving police security. It often requires abandoning one's hometown, leaving behind familiar routines, accepting an uncertain future, and living with constant awareness that ordinary freedoms have disappeared. Physical safety, while essential, cannot erase loneliness. Secure apartments cannot replace family. Police protection cannot remove grief. Rita's life, after cooperating with authorities, illustrates this reality with heartbreaking clarity. She had already endured the murders of her father and brother before entering witness protection. She then lost the support of her mother because of her decision to reject Omerta. Finally, the assassination of Paolo Borsellino deprived her of the person who had become her greatest source of emotional reassurance. Looking at these events together reveals a pattern of cumulative loss rather than a single isolated tragedy. Each event intensified the next until the emotional weight became unbearable. Remembering Rita responsibly also requires resisting the temptation to romanticize her death. Her story should never be interpreted as suggesting that suffering itself is noble or that tragedy is the inevitable price of courage. Instead, her life reminds us that those who stand against organized crime often require far more than physical protection. They also need enduring emotional support, stability, and recognition of the psychological burdens they carry. Rita's despair during the final week of her life demonstrates how vulnerable even the bravest individuals can become after repeated trauma and overwhelming loss. The relationship between Rita and Paolo Borsellino further reinforces this lesson. Their connection was built upon trust formed through the process of seeking justice. Rita referred to him affectionately as Uncle Paolo, reflecting the comfort she found in his guidance during an extraordinarily uncertain period. His assassination on Via D'Amelio therefore represented far more than the loss of a prosecutor assigned to her case. It removed the person she believed understood her sacrifices and believed in the future she hoped her testimony could help create. The grief that followed cannot be separated from the broader history of anti-mafia violence in Italy during 1992, a year marked by devastating attacks against those committed to confronting organized crime. Despite the tragedy of her final days, Rita's voice was not silenced. Every school bearing her name, every anti-mafia association inspired by her example, every book or film that introduces new generations to her story extends the impact of the choice she made in 1991. Young people learning about organized crime encounter not only accounts of violence, but also the example of someone their own age who refused to accept silence as the only option. In that sense, Rita continues to contribute to the fight against the culture that once sought to control her life. Her story also reminds us that the consequences of organized crime extend far beyond criminal statistics or courtroom proceedings. Every act of violence leaves behind parents, children, siblings, and communities forced to rebuild their lives after irreversible loss. Rita experienced that reality repeatedly. First, her father disappeared from her life through mafia violence. Then her brother followed. Her mother's rejection separated her from the remaining bond that might have provided comfort. Finally, Paolo Borsellino's assassination extinguished the hope she had placed in the person guiding her through witness protection. Behind every legal case stood a teenager trying to understand how so much of her world had vanished in such a short time. As decades have passed, Rita Atria has become more than a historical figure associated with one period of Italy's anti-mafia struggle. She has become a reminder that individual choices matter, even when they cannot immediately transform the world. She could not dismantle Cosa Nostra by herself. She could not undo the murders that had devastated her family. She could not prevent the assassination of Paolo Borsellino. Yet she could decide whether the truth she carried would remain hidden forever. That decision continues to define her legacy. If there is a lasting lesson in Rita's life, it is that silence and fear are never merely abstract concepts. They shape families, communities, institutions, and futures. Breaking that silence often demands extraordinary sacrifice from ordinary people. Rita Atria was one of those ordinary people. She was not born a public symbol or a national heroine. She was a teenager whose life unfolded under circumstances she never chose. When history confronted her with an impossible decision, she chose justice over silence, even though the cost proved devastatingly high. The story that began in the small Sicilian town of Partana, therefore, does not conclude with the locked door of a safe apartment in Rome. It continues wherever people refuse to accept intimidation as a substitute for truth. It continues in classrooms where students learn that courage is sometimes quiet rather than dramatic. It continues in the work of anti-mafia organizations that preserve the memory of those who challenged organized crime despite overwhelming odds. Most importantly, it continues in the enduring recognition that Rita Atria was never defined solely by the tragedy of her death. She is remembered because, at only 17 years old, she chose to break omerta, transforming her brief life into a lasting testament to the power of conscience, integrity, and the belief that even in the darkest circumstances, telling the truth remains one of the bravest acts a person can perform. Every story eventually reaches a point where the investigation is over. The official documents have been filed away, and the headlines begin to disappear. New events replace old ones. Court records become archives. The names that once dominated newspaper pages gradually fade from public attention. Yet some stories refuse to remain confined to history because they continue to ask questions that every new generation must answer for itself. Rita Atria's story is one of them. Although her life lasted only 17 years, the questions she left behind have endured for decades, reaching far beyond the circumstances of her own tragedy. Looking back, it is striking how ordinary Rita's dreams might once have been before violence repeatedly interrupted her life. She was born into circumstances she did not choose. She had no control over the family that welcomed her into the world, the criminal organization that surrounded her community, or the conflicts that claimed the lives of those closest to her. The defining events of her childhood arrived one after another with relentless force. Her father's murder introduced her to irreversible loss before she had even reached adolescence. Her brother's murder confirmed that the cycle of violence showed no sign of ending. The rejection she later experienced from her own mother deprived her of another emotional anchor. Finally, the assassination of Paolo Borsellino destroyed the person who had become her greatest source of reassurance during the most uncertain period of her life. None of those events were choices she made. The only true choice she possessed was deciding whether to remain silent or to tell the truth. That decision transformed the meaning of her life. Many people inherit fear. Far fewer decide to confront it. Rita understood that speaking with investigators would fundamentally change everything she had ever known. She knew that cooperating with the authorities meant abandoning the unwritten rules that governed the environment in which she had grown up. She knew it would isolate her from the community she had always called home. She knew it would place her under constant protection and force her to begin a new life far away from Sicily. She also knew that her own family might never forgive her. Yet despite understanding those consequences, she chose to cooperate because she believed that silence could no longer be justified after everything she had witnessed. Her testimony became more than evidence in criminal investigations. It became proof that omerta was not absolute. For generations, the mafia relied upon the belief that no one born inside its world would ever dare reveal its secrets. Fear preserved that illusion. Loyalty reinforced it. Rita's actions demonstrated that even someone raised within a mafia-connected family could reject the culture of silence without ever having participated in organized crime herself. That distinction continues to make her story uniquely powerful. She did not abandon criminal activity because she had never embraced it. Instead, she rejected the expectation that family background should determine moral responsibility. History often remembers famous prosecutors, judges, and political leaders because their decisions influence national events. Rita's importance lies elsewhere. She represents the countless ordinary individuals whose names rarely appear in history books despite the extraordinary courage required by their circumstances. She possessed no institutional authority. She had no ability to command investigations or prosecute criminals. She could offer investigators only one thing: the truth she carried in her memory. Sometimes that is the most valuable contribution anyone can make. The tragedy of Rita's final week should never overshadow the significance of the months that came before it. It is understandable that many people remember the heartbreaking image of a 17-year-old, overcome by despair after Paolo Borsellino's assassination, yet focusing only on her death risks, overlooking the remarkable determination that preceded it. Before fear consumed her final days, Rita had already accomplished something extraordinary. She had helped investigators challenge an organization that many believed untouchable. Together with Pira Aiello, she contributed to arrests and broader investigations that expanded the understanding of mafia activity in Partana. Those achievements remain part of her legacy just as surely as the sadness surrounding her death. Her experience also reminds us that justice is rarely achieved by legal institutions alone. Courts depend upon witnesses willing to speak. Investigators depend upon people prepared to share information despite personal risk. Laws can punish crimes only after someone has found the courage to expose them. Rita became one of those indispensable voices. Without witnesses, countless acts of organized crime would remain permanently concealed behind fear. Her willingness to testify, therefore, illustrates one of the fundamental truths of every justice system. The pursuit of accountability often begins with an individual deciding that silence can no longer continue. Another enduring lesson emerges from the emotional burden Rita carried. Her story demonstrates that protecting witnesses involves far more than ensuring physical safety. She lived under police protection in Rome because authorities recognized the dangers surrounding her. Cooperation. Yet physical protection alone could not heal profound emotional wounds. She remained a teenager grieving her father and brother, separated from her hometown, rejected by her mother, and devastated by the murder of the prosecutor she trusted most. The loneliness she experienced serves as a reminder that the consequences of organized crime extend into every aspect of a person's life. Violence leaves psychological scars that cannot always be measured through official reports or legal documents. This understanding has become an important part of how many people now remember Rita. Her story encourages reflection not only on courage, but also on responsibility. Societies asking individuals to testify against dangerous criminal organizations must also recognize the immense emotional demands placed upon those witnesses. Rita's life illustrates both the necessity of speaking the truth and the importance of supporting those brave enough to do so. Today, her name continues to be associated with schools, anti-mafia organizations, books, and films that preserve the memory of her decision. These tributes do more than honor a young woman whose life ended too soon. They ensure that future generations encounter an example of conscience overcoming fear. Students learning about the history of organized crime in Italy discover that resistance did not come only from famous magistrates or law enforcement officers. Sometimes it came from a 17-year-old girl who refused to allow violence to dictate the rest of her life. There's another reason why Rita's story continues to resonate decades later. It reminds us that courage is often quiet. It does not always appear in dramatic speeches or public ceremonies. Sometimes courage exists in confidential interviews with prosecutors, in the difficult decision to tell the truth despite overwhelming pressure to remain silent, or in accepting the painful consequences of choosing what one believes to be right. Rita's actions reflected precisely that kind of courage. They were deeply personal decisions made without any guarantee that history would remember her. In many ways, the relationship between Rita and Paolo Borsellino symbolizes the larger struggle against organized crime. One represented the institutions of justice. The other represented an ordinary citizen willing to trust those institutions despite every reason to remain afraid. Their stories became connected through a shared belief that truth mattered more than intimidation. Although both lives ended tragically within a single week of July 1992, the ideals they represented survived them. Their commitment to justice continued through the investigations they supported and through the people inspired by their example. As time passes, historical memory inevitably simplifies complex lives. Rita Atria is sometimes remembered only as the teenage witness who died shortly after Paolo Borsellino's assassination. While that sequence of events is historically accurate, it captures only the final chapter of a much larger story. Before she became a symbol, she was a daughter mourning her father. She was a sister grieving her brother. She was a young woman struggling to determine whether loyalty meant protecting silence or pursuing justice. She was a witness who believed that the truth deserved to be spoken even when doing so required, sacrificing almost everything familiar. Remembering those dimensions of her life restores the humanity that can sometimes disappear behind historical labels. The official conclusion regarding Rita's death remains unchanged. Authorities determined that she died by suicide on July 26, 1992. That legal finding forms an essential part of her history and should never be replaced by speculation unsupported by evidence. At the same time, understanding her story requires looking beyond legal terminology to appreciate the accumulation of loss, fear, isolation, and grief that preceded that final day. Doing so does not alter the facts. It simply acknowledges the human experience behind them. Perhaps the most fitting way to remember Rita Atria is not through the circumstances of her death, but through the decision that defined her life. In a world governed by intimidation, she chose honesty. In a culture shaped by omerta, she chose to speak. In an environment where many believed silence guaranteed survival, she demonstrated that conscience could still prevail over fear. Her life was brief, and its ending remains profoundly tragic. But the example she left behind continues to endure. Long after the investigations concluded and the headlines faded, Rita Atria's voice still echoes through every effort to oppose organized crime with truth instead of silence, reminding us that even the quietest voice can leave a legacy far greater than anyone could have imagined.